It was the size of a coat button, magnetic, tucked up inside the wheel arch where no one would ever think to look. And the moment I held it in my hand, I knew that someone inside the palace had been lying to all of us for a very long time. But I'm starting in the wrong place. Let me back up, the way you have to with a story like this, where nothing means what it first seems to and the truth keeps moving on you like a shadow at the end of the day. My name is Eric Sandoval. For 11 years I served in the household guard of the royal house of Valmont, and before you go looking it up, don't bother, because Valmont isn't a country you'll find on any map you own. It's a small, old, proud place, the kind of country with more history than territory, tucked into the folds of the continent, with a royal family that goes back 600 years and a palace that's half fortress and half museum. I tell you this so you understand the world I'm describing. Ancient, formal, beautiful, and absolutely seething, underneath the guilt and the ceremony, with the oldest game in the world. The game of who is close to power and who is being pushed away from it. I was never a player in that game. Guards aren't. We're the board, not the pieces. We stand at the doors and the gates and the edges of the rooms where the game is played, and we see everything and we say nothing, and the players forget we're there. That's the whole secret of my profession. People will say and do astonishing things in front of a guard, because to them, a guard is a piece of architecture with a pulse. Which is exactly why I was the one who found it, because nobody thinks the architecture is watching. The princess in this story is Princess Adela. She'd married into the house of Valmont, married the crown prince, Frederick the heir, and from the day she arrived, the entire country had fallen in love with her. I don't say that lightly. There are royals people respect and royals people fear, and then once in a generation there's a royal people simply love, and Adela was that. She was warm in a way that the old palace had forgotten was possible. She remembered the names of the kitchen staff and the gardener's children. She'd stop on a freezing morning and actually talk to the guards at the gate, to us, the architecture, and ask how we were and mean it. I'd guarded her on and off for 3 years by the time of the device, and I'll be honest with you, I'd have walked through fire for her, and so would most of the household staff, the ones who actually did the work of keeping that palace running. The grand people upstairs, the courtiers, the old families who'd circled the throne for centuries, they were a different matter. With them, Adela's warmth and her popularity were not entirely welcome, because in a court, love is power. And the more the country loved Adela, the more powerful she became, and the more powerful she became, the more she threatened people who'd spent their whole lives accumulating their own small share of nearness to the throne. You see how it works. You can already feel the shape of it. Somebody, in all that ancient jealousy, decided that the beloved princess needed watching. It was a wet spring morning when I found it. There'd been rain in the night, the heavy kind, and the cobbles of the inner courtyard were dark and slick and shining, and there was that smell in the air that comes after spring rain, wet stone and earth, and something green trying to grow up through the cracks. The palace was quiet. It was early, before the day's engagements, before the courtyard filled with the comings and goings of the household. I was on a duty I didn't usually do. One of the close protection lads, a friend of mine named Cobb, had gone down with a fever, and I'd been asked to cover part of his mourning, which included a security walk-around of the vehicles before the princess's first engagement. It was routine. You check the cars. You look underneath. You check the wheel arches. You make sure nothing's been tampered with overnight. In 11 years, I'd done it 1,000 times, and never found anything more sinister than a stray cat sheltering under a chassis. The princess's car that morning was a dark official saloon, parked in its usual bay in the inner courtyard. I went around it the way you're trained to, slow, methodical, mirror on a pole for the underside, hands and eyes checking the places a person might hide a thing. And when I got to the rear wheel arch on the offside, my fingers, running up inside the curve of the metal, found something that did not belong. Small, hard, cold, held in place by a magnet strong enough that I had to work it free. I crouched there in the wet courtyard, and I opened my hand and I looked at it, and my stomach dropped straight through the cobbles. I knew what it was. You don't serve 11 years in royal protection without learning to recognize the tools of the trade, and this was a tracker, a good one. Not some cheap thing you'd buy online, a proper professional-grade tracking device, the kind that's expensive and hard to get and tells you in real time exactly where a vehicle is every minute of every day. Someone had attached it to the princess's car. Someone had been following her, watching her movements, building somewhere a complete picture of where Adela went and when and how often and to whom. And here is the thought that made the courtyard tilt around me, kneeling there with the rain soaking through the knees of my trousers. This had been done from the inside. That car lived in the inner courtyard. The inner courtyard was behind 3 layers of security. You did not simply wander in off the street and attach a device to a royal vehicle in the most protected space in the country. To get to that car, overnight unseen, with the time and the access to fit a magnetic tracker into a wheel arch, you had to belong. You had to be someone with the right pass, the right face, the right to be there at an hour when no one would question you. You had to be one of us. Household. Inner circle. The betrayal was already baked into the device before I even understood who'd planted it. Whoever had done this wasn't an outside threat. It was someone who walked these corridors. Someone who smiled at the princess by day and tracked her by night. Someone I probably knew. Someone I'd probably stood beside, held a door for, said good morning to. I closed my hand around the little device, and I felt the cold of it against my palm. And I made a decision that I look back on now as either the bravest or the stupidest of my life. I didn't report it, not straight away, not through the normal channels. I need to explain why, because it matters, and because it's not the decision a good soldier is supposed to make. The normal thing, the correct thing by the book, would have been to take the device immediately to my superior, to hand it up the chain, to let the proper security apparatus take over. And in any normal situation, that's exactly what I'd have done without a second's thought. But this wasn't a normal situation, and I understood that the instant I grasped that the thing had been planted from the inside. Because if someone within the household had the access and the audacity to track the princess's car, then they almost certainly had reach within the security apparatus itself. The chain of command I was supposed to report to, how could I know it was clean? How could I know that the very person I handed this device to wasn't connected somehow to the person who'd planted it? In a court, everyone is connected to everyone. Favors, loyalties, old debts, family ties going back generations. If I reported it through the normal channels, there was a real chance, not a certainty, but a real chance, that the device would simply disappear quietly, and a report would get filed saying the vehicle check found nothing, and whoever was watching Adela would simply be warned that they'd been discovered, and would melt back into the woodwork, and I'd never find them, and the princess would never be safe. I couldn't risk that. I cared too much about her to risk that. So I did something else. I put the device in my pocket, still active, still transmitting, because if I disabled it, whoever was watching would know instantly that it had been found. I let it keep doing its job. I let them keep thinking they were watching the princess, when in fact the thing was now riding around in the breast pocket of a guard who had decided, on his own and against every rule, to find out who was on the other end of it. It was reckless. It was probably illegal. It was certainly the kind of thing that ends a career and worse. But I looked at that little cold device in my hand, in the wet courtyard in the gray spring light, and I thought of Adela stopping to ask me how I was on a freezing morning, meaning it, and I knew I couldn't hand the thing up a chain I didn't trust and just hope. Some debts you pay yourself. The first thing I needed was someone I could trust absolutely. And in a court where everyone is connected to everyone, that's a terrifyingly short list. There was exactly one name on mine. A woman named Brunn, Sergeant Brunn, though everyone just called her Brunn, who ran the vehicle pool and the garages. She was in her 60s, had served the House of Valmont for 40 years, and was the single most incorruptible human being I have ever met. She had no ambition, no faction, no interest whatsoever in the games of the court. She loved engines, and she loved the royal family with a plain, unglamorous, bone-deep loyalty, and she despised the courtiers and their intrigues with a contempt she didn't bother to hide. If there was one person in that entire palace I was certain had no hand in planting a tracker on the princess's car, it was Brunn, because Brunn would have considered it a desecration of one of her vehicles and would have throttled the culprit with her bare hands. I went to her that same morning to the garages, which smelled of oil and metal and old leather, and I showed her the device, and I told her where I'd found it, and I watched her face go from puzzlement to comprehension to a slow, cold, terrible fury. She didn't say much. Brunn never did. She turned the little tracker over in her oil-stained fingers, examining it with the eye of a woman who knew machines, and then she looked up at me and she said, very quietly, "Someone got into my courtyard, past my cars, and did this." She set it down on the workbench like it was something diseased. "Right," she said. "You and me then, quietly, we find out who." And that was the beginning of it. A guard and an old sergeant in a garage that smelled of oil, deciding to do something we had absolutely no authority to do, to hunt, alone and in secret, for a traitor inside the most secure building in the country. We had one advantage. The traitor didn't know we'd found their device. As far as they knew, they were still watching the princess, safe and unseen. They had no idea that the thing they'd planted to watch her had just become the thread that was going to lead us straight back to them. But the trail, when we started to follow it, did not lead where either of us expected. It led somewhere stranger and sadder, and far closer to the throne than I'd ever dared to imagine. That's where the story really begins. Brunn and I worked out our plan in the garage that first night, over cold coffee, with the device sitting on the workbench between us like a small black accusation. The principle was simple, even if doing it was anything but. The tracker told whoever planted it where the princess's car went. So if we could find out where the tracker's data was going, who was receiving it, where, on what device, we'd have our traitor. But that was the hard part, the part neither of us had the skill or the access to do. Reading the signal, tracing it back to a receiver, that was specialist work, the kind of thing the palace's technical security people did, and they were exactly the chain I didn't dare trust. So we couldn't trace the signal. We had to do it the old-fashioned way, the human way, Brunn's way. "You don't catch a rat by following the wire," she said, turning the device over in her fingers. "You catch a rat by watching the hole it comes out of." She tapped the tracker. "Somebody put this on the car, in my courtyard, overnight. That means somebody was in the courtyard at the right hour with the access to be there and not be questioned. The signal's a dead end for us, but the planting, that leaves a trail, cameras, logs, door records, who was where and when. That we can get at." Quietly. She was right, and she was the perfect person to do it, because as head of the vehicle pool she had legitimate, unremarkable reasons to look at courtyard access logs and garage camera footage. Nobody would think twice about Brunn reviewing security around her own vehicles. It was the most natural thing in the world. So that's what we did. While the device rode around in my pocket, still faithfully transmitting an empty story to whoever was watching, Brunn went quietly to work in the background, pulling the records for the inner courtyard for the nights before I'd found it, looking for the one face that didn't belong, at the one hour when no one should have been there. It took her 4 days, and what she found turned the whole thing on its head. I remember the evening she came to me with it. We met in the garage again. It had become our place, the one room in that palace where I felt I could breathe. She had a folder under her arm and her face was strange. Not triumphant, the way you'd expect from someone who'd caught a traitor. Troubled, almost sad. "I found who planted it," she said. "I've got them on camera, clear as day. The night before you found it 2:40 in the morning in the courtyard at the princess's car." She paused. "And I don't understand it, Eric, because it makes no sense." She opened the folder and showed me a still image, printed from the footage. A figure crouched by the rear wheel of the princess's car, in the dark, doing exactly what I'd have expected a traitor to be doing. And the face, caught in the grain of the image, looking up for just a moment toward the courtyard, was a face I knew well. A face everyone in the household knew and mostly liked. It was Marius, old Marius, one of the princess's own personal staff. A quiet, gentle man in his late 50s who'd been with Adela since the very beginning, since before her marriage he'd come with her, part of her own small household, one of the handful of people she'd brought into the palace from her old life. He was devoted to her. Devoted. I'd seen it 100 times. He fussed over her schedule, worried about her health, treated her with a tenderness that was almost fatherly. If you'd asked me to name the people in that palace least likely to betray the princess, Marius would have been at the very top of the list, right beside Brun. And here he was, on camera at 2:40 in the morning, planting a tracker on her car. "It makes no sense," Brun said again quietly. "That man loves her. I've watched him for 3 years. He'd die for her. Why would he spy on her?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew there was only one way to get one, and it wasn't through any chain of command. It was to go to Marius himself. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Marius, because it's the heart of this whole story, and because it taught me something I've never forgotten about how wrong you can be about a thing you're certain you understand. I found him alone the next evening in the small pantry off the princess's apartments where he kept her things in order. I closed the door, and I didn't accuse him, not at first. I just took the device out of my pocket, the device he thought was still on the car, still working, and I set it down on the table in front of him. I have never seen the color drain from a man's face so fast. He looked at the little tracker and he looked at me, and he understood everything in an instant, that he'd been caught, that the game was up. And then, instead of denying it, instead of bluffing, this gentle old man simply sat down heavily in a chair and put his face in his hands and began to shake. "Oh, thank God," he said, muffled through his hands. "Thank God it's over. I couldn't do it anymore. Thank God." That was not what I'd expected a traitor to say. I sat down across from him and I said, as gently as I could manage, "Marius, tell me, why are you tracking her? Who are you doing it for?" And he looked up at me, this devoted old man with tears running down his weathered face, and he told me the truth. And the truth was so far from anything I'd imagined that I had to grip the edge of the table. He wasn't spying on her against her. He was being forced to spy on her, and the thing that was forcing him was the thing that had been quietly destroying him for 2 years. It had started, he told me, with his granddaughter, the only family he had left in the world. A girl of 19, his late son's child, whom he'd raised himself after the boy died. She was everything to him, and 2 years earlier she got herself into trouble, serious trouble, the kind with debts and dangerous people and threats. The details poured out of him in a broken rush, and I won't repeat all of them, but the shape of it was this. His granddaughter owed money to people who hurt those who didn't pay, and Marius, a palace servant on a servant's wage, had no way to protect her. And then someone had come to him, quietly. Someone who knew about his granddaughter's debt, knew about it in detail, which meant they'd gone looking, which meant they'd chosen him precisely because of this weakness. And this someone had made him an offer that was really a threat dressed as a kindness. "We'll handle your granddaughter's debt. We'll make the dangerous people go away. She'll be safe. And in return, all you have to do is keep us informed about the princess. Her movements, her schedule, where she goes, nothing harmful, just information." He'd refused at first. Of course he had. But then his granddaughter had been hurt, a warning, a deliberate one, time to teach him the cost of refusing, and Marius, terrified, out of options, with no one to turn to and no faith that the palace would protect a servant's granddaughter from people like that, had given in. He'd taken the devil's bargain, He'd started feeding them information. And when they wanted more, when knowing her schedule wasn't enough and they wanted to track her car directly, they'd given him the device and told him where to put it. And he, hating himself with every breath, had crept out at 2:40 in the morning and done it. Every day, he wept, every single day I have betrayed the kindest person I have ever known to protect the only family I have left. And I have prayed every day that someone would catch me, that someone would find the device and end it, because I could not end it myself. I couldn't choose between her and my granddaughter. I'm a coward, Eric. I'm a coward, and I've been drowning for 2 years, and you've just pulled me out, and I don't even care what happens to me now. I'm just glad it's over. I sat there in that little pantry with my head spinning, because everything I'd thought I understood had just inverted. Marius wasn't the traitor. Marius was a victim, a frightened old man squeezed in a vice by someone who deliberately hunted for his weakness and then used it without mercy. The real traitor wasn't the man on the camera. It was the person who'd come to him. The person who'd known about the granddaughter, found the pressure point and applied it. The person at the other end of all that information. Who, I said, Marius, who came to you? Who is it going to? And he gave me a name. I'm not going to give you the name yet, because when I heard it, it meant nothing to me, and I want you to feel the same slow dawning that I felt. It was the name of someone fairly junior, an aide, a nobody on the face of it, a smooth, pleasant, forgettable young man who worked in one of the administrative offices, the kind of person who carries papers and arranges meetings and is never important enough to notice. But Brunn, when I told her, went very still, because Brunn, with her 40 years and her contempt for the court and her encyclopedic knowledge of who served whom, knew exactly who that junior aide really worked for, knew whose creature he was, knew which powerful figure, high up near the throne, used that pleasant, forgettable young man as a cutout, a layer of deniability between themselves and the dirty work. "Oh," she said softly when I told her the name, and she sat down. "Oh, Eric, it's worse than I thought. That little weasel is hers." "Whose?" I said. And Brunn told me. And when she said the name, the real name, the one at the top, the one the junior aide was only a shield for, I understood that we had pulled on a thread attached to something far larger and far more dangerous than 2 frightened men in a pantry. We'd pulled on a thread that led up past the staff, past the aides, up into the rarefied air near the throne itself, to one of the most powerful people in the entire house of Valmont. And that person had no idea yet that a guard and an old sergeant had unraveled their secret, which meant we still had one move left, one dangerous, single move to use that ignorance before it ran out. That's the last part of the story. The name at the top of the thread was Countess Hale. She was one of the great figures of the court, a woman of about 60, from one of the oldest families in Valmont, who had spent her entire life in the orbit of the throne and had accumulated over those decades an enormous quiet power. She held a senior household position, the kind with a grand title and vague duties that really meant she is close to the center, and she knows everything, and you do not cross her. For 30 years she had been one of the most important people in the palace that nobody outside it had ever heard of. The kind of power that doesn't want to be seen. The kind that works through junior aides and cutouts and frightened old servants, and never, ever leaves its own fingerprints on anything. And she had been surveilling the princess, building a file, tracking her every movement. Why? Brunn and I could only guess, but the guess wasn't hard. Adela was beloved, and Adela was becoming powerful, and Adela was new, an outsider who'd married in and won the country's heart, and who represented, to a woman like Countess Hale, a threat to the old order in which people like the Countess held all the strings. She wanted leverage. She wanted to know Adela's secrets, her habits, her vulnerabilities, anything that could be used someday to control her, or discredit her, or simply keep her in check. It was the oldest move in the oldest game. Knowledge is power, and the Countess had decided to acquire knowledge of the princess by any means necessary, including crushing a gentle old servant's granddaughter to turn him into a spy. Now I knew. Brunn knew, Marius knew, and the Countess didn't know that we knew. That was the only card we had, and we had to play it perfectly, because if we played it wrong, if we went up the official chain, into a security apparatus where the Countess had 30 years of favors and loyalties woven through every level, the whole thing would vanish. The device would be lost, Marius would be quietly destroyed, and the Countess would simply find another way, another pressure point, another frightened servant. We'd have one shot, and we couldn't afford to waste it on a chain of commands she might own. So we decided to go around all of it. We decided to go straight to the one person in the entire palace whose power was greater than the Countess's, and whom the Countess could not touch. We decided to go to the princess herself. It was the hardest thing I ever did in that uniform, harder than any post I ever stood, any threat I ever faced. To request, through Marius, a private audience with Princess Adela. To stand in front of the woman I'd sworn to protect, the woman who'd asked me how I was on freezing mornings and meant it, and tell her that one of her own beloved staff had been tracking her car, and that the trail led to one of the most powerful people in her husband's house, and that I, a guard, architecture with a pulse, had spent 2 weeks investigating it in secret because I hadn't trusted the official channels to be clean. I was certain it would end my career. I'd broken a dozen rules. I'd concealed a security breach. I'd run a private investigation I had no authority to run. By every regulation, I should have been dismissed on the spot, maybe worse. But I'd weighed all of that against the alternative, against the Countess winning, against Adela being watched and controlled and never even knowing, and I decided that my career was a small price. Some debts you pay yourself. We met in a small private sitting room early before the day's engagements, just the Princess, Brunn, Marius, and me, and I laid it all out, the device, the wheel arch, the decision not to report it, Brunn's investigation, the camera footage, and then with Marius sitting beside me shaking, ready to face whatever came, the truth of why he'd done it, the granddaughter, the debt, the threat, the 2 years of a good man drowning. And finally the name at the top, Countess Hale. I watched the princess's face through all of it. She listened without a word, completely still, her hands folded in her lap, and I couldn't read her. I genuinely couldn't tell whether I was about to be thanked or destroyed. When I finished, there was a long silence. And then Princess Adela did 3 things, in an order I have never forgotten, that told me everything about why the country loved her, and why people like the Countess were right to be afraid of her. The first thing she did was turn to Marius. Not to me, not to the betrayal of herself, to the old man who had spied on her, and she reached out and she took his shaking hands in both of hers and she said, and her voice was thick, "Marius, you should have come to me. The very first day they threatened her, you should have come to me. Do you understand? Your granddaughter is my family too, because you are. I would have protected her. I will protect her now. You have been carrying this alone for 2 years, terrified, and that is the thing that breaks my heart, not that you tracked my car, that I never knew you were so afraid, that you didn't know you could come to me." Marius broke down completely, and so I'll admit, did I, a little, standing there, because she'd had every right to feel betrayed, and instead the first thing out of her was concern for the frightened man who'd betrayed her, and for a 19-year-old girl she'd never met. That was Adela. That was exactly, precisely Adela. The second thing she did was turn to Brunn and me. And she looked at us for a long moment and she said, "You broke every rule you have. You concealed a breach. You investigated in secret. You took an enormous risk to yourselves with no protection and no authority." A pause. "You did it because you didn't trust the system to protect me. And you were right not to trust it because the rot went all the way up into it. You too, a guard and a sergeant, were the only clean part of my own security. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what I owe you?" Her eyes were bright. "Everything, I owe you everything, and I will not forget it, not ever." And the third thing she did, the thing that ended it, was stand up, very straight, and become, in an instant, not the warm woman who asked guards how they were, but something else. Something I'd never seen in her before. The full, cold, formidable power of a princess of Valmont, who has just learned that someone tried to make her prey. "Now," she said quietly, "let us discuss Countess Hale." I won't pretend I was in the room for what came after, because I wasn't. That was above my level, and rightly so. But I know how it ended, because the whole palace eventually knew, in the quiet way these things become known. The princess did not go through the compromised security chain. She went, with the evidence we'd given her, directly to the very top, to the king, and to her husband the crown prince, privately, completely, with the device and the footage and Marius's testimony all laid out. And against that, even 30 years of accumulated power could not stand. There was no public scandal. The House of Valmont does not air its wounds in public, it never has. But Countess Hale was gone within the month. Quietly retired, stripped of her position and her access, her web of favors unraveled, sent away from the throne she'd spent her life circling, never to return. The junior aide, her cutout, went with her. The whole rotten little operation was pulled out by the roots. And Marius's granddaughter was protected, really protected this time, by the actual power of the crown rather than the false promises of a blackmailer. The debt was handled. The dangerous people were made to understand, in the way that royal houses can make people understand, that the girl was now entirely out of their reach. Marius kept his position. The princess insisted on it. "He didn't betray me," she said, in the one comment of hers about it that filtered down to us. "He was failed by all of us, and then he was used. The person who betrayed me is gone. He stays." As for Brun and me, there was no medal, no ceremony, no public thanks. There couldn't be. The whole thing had to stay quiet. But about a week after it was all over, a small parcel arrived for each of us, with no note and no name, though we knew exactly who'd sent it. Brun's was a beautiful set of old engineering tools, the kind a master mechanic of an earlier century would have treasured, clearly chosen by someone who understood exactly what Brun loved. Mine was a watch, an old one, simple, worn, and engraved on the back in tiny letters were 4 words. "To the clean part." That's all. To the clean part. I have worn it every day since. I wore it for the rest of my service, and I wear it now in my retirement, and when people ask about it, I just say it was a gift from someone I once helped, which is true, and I leave it at that. But I know what it means. It means that in a place rotten with the oldest and dirtiest game in the world, the game of power and proximity and quiet betrayal, a guard and an old sergeant turned out to be the clean part. The part that couldn't be bought or threatened or woven into the web. And that a beloved princess, surrounded by people who smiled at her and watched her in the dark, found out that her safety, in the end, came not from the grand apparatus of the court but from the architecture. From the people nobody thinks are watching. I've told this story a few times now over the years, and people always want it to be about the spy device. The gadget, the thriller of it, the hidden tracker, the secret investigation, the powerful villain unmasked. And it is about those things, I suppose. But that's not what it's about to me. To me it's about Marius. About a gentle old man who loved a princess and was made, by someone crueler and more powerful than him, to hurt the thing he loved most, to save the other thing he loved most, and who carried that impossible weight in silence for 2 years, praying every single day to be caught. It's about how the person you're so sure is the villain is sometimes just the most frightened person in the room. It's about how the real rot is almost never the trembling hand that plants the device. It's the cold, clean, untouchable hand that found the trembling man's weakness and squeezed. And it's about Adela, about what she did with the truth when she finally had it, how the first thing she reached for wasn't revenge for her own betrayal, but the hand of the man who betrayed her, and concern for a frightened girl she'd never met. That's a kind of power, too, a rarer kind than the Countess ever had. The Countess spent 30 years accumulating power over people. Adela had the other kind, the kind that comes from people, freely given, because of exactly the woman she was. And in the end, the second kind beat the first kind, completely, the way it almost never does in the real world and the way I'll always be quietly glad it did in mine. They tracked her car for 2 years, they knew everywhere she went. But they never understood the one thing that mattered, the thing that beat them in the end. That the woman they were hunting was so loved that even her architecture would risk everything to protect her. You can track where a person goes. You can never track why people would walk through fire for them. That the Countess never learned, and it's the only thing that was ever worth knowing.